Chapter 1. Light in the Winter Night. Jack Cole was the kind of man the entire city knew, or at least they knew his name. A real estate tycoon, owner of numerous hotels and luxury buildings, Jack stood at the pinnacle of success at the age of 36. From upscale apartment complexes to lavish resorts, every corner of the city seemed to bear his mark. Yet despite being surrounded by lavish walls and immense wealth, Jack was a lonely man. His life was a series of endless meetings, extravagant parties, and million-dollar deals. Success came easily, but when he returned to his vast mansion in the suburbs, silence was the only thing waiting for him behind the door. The fireplace in his home was always burning, but the atmosphere remained cold. The house had too many rooms, but none truly felt like home. Jack had no family. His friends were mostly business partners, and the women in his life, if any, were fleeting relationships too brief to leave a mark. This winter was colder than usual. Snow fell thick, blanketing the streets, prolonging the sense of stillness and gloom. By day, the city buzzed with hurried crowds, but when night fell, only shadows and the golden glow of streetlights stretching across the snow remained. Jack often had the habit of driving through the streets at night, partly to pass the time, partly to seek some quiet. For him, the hum of the tires on empty roads was one of the rare things that brought his mind a temporary sense of peace. That evening, Jack planned to drive straight home after a long meeting. His car glided past familiar high-rises, through quiet streets, until he passed the local hospital. As he slowed at an intersection, a scene across the street unintentionally held him back. On the snow-covered steps in front of the hospital entrance, a petite girl in a worn nurse's coat was bending down to help a homeless man. The man was shivering, his lips pale, and his exhausted posture suggested he had been out in the freezing cold for too long. Snow continued to fall on their shoulders, but the girl seemed unfazed by it. The nurse knelt down, said something to him, then carefully helped him step by step inside. Her small hands gripped his arm tightly, even though both seemed almost swallowed by the biting cold. The way she assisted him, gentle yet firm, had a calmness that Jack couldn't look away from. The faint glow of the streetlights enveloped her small frame, casting a soft halo in the frozen space. Every gesture of hers exuded an unusual dedication and patience. Jack sat in his car, hands still on the steering wheel, but he couldn't bring himself to drive away. He pulled over to the side, turned off the engine, and sat silently. It wasn't the first time he had seen homeless people in front of the hospital, nor the first time he had witnessed healthcare workers doing their jobs. But something was different in the way this girl acted. Jack watched until the two disappeared behind the hospital doors. Only then did he realize he had been sitting there for quite some time. His eyes lingered on the closed door as he felt something stir within him, an unfamiliar feeling he hadn't faced before. On the drive home, the image of the girl and the homeless man kept replaying in his mind. This city was full of people like her, those willing to spend their time and effort for strangers. But what made her stand in the snow on such a cold winter night to help someone most people would ignore? Jack wondered. Did she ever feel tired? Did she ever feel that her dedication was in vain? And what made her believe in such small acts of kindness? When he arrived home, Jack stepped through the grand doors of his mansion. But for the first time, the emptiness of the place felt too real to ignore. He sat down by the fireplace, watching the flames flicker, and wondered. Was the difference between her and him not in wealth or success, but in the way she viewed life? Welcome to the next story on Soul Stories. Let us know which city you're listening from. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out on more meaningful stories. Chapter 2. The Fading Center. Inside the hospital's staff room, the hum of the heater blended with the warm glow of yellow lights, casting soft shadows on the walls. It created a cozy atmosphere amidst the biting cold outside. Sophie Lane sat at her desk, carefully recording patient information. She wasn't just a dedicated nurse, but someone who poured her heart into helping the vulnerable in her community. Sophie was the kind of person people remembered, not because of any striking appearance, but for the sincerity in her eyes and the warmth of her smile. At just 28 years old, Sophie had been in the medical field for nearly 6 years. She was always the first to volunteer when the hospital organized free clinics for the homeless, or when Hope Shelter, the only homeless support center in the area, needed assistance. Hope Shelter was where Sophie spent most of her time after work. The center was a last refuge for many homeless individuals in the city, a place where they could seek shelter from the cold, receive a hot meal, and find a temporary bed for the night. But now the aging building was on the brink of collapse. The roof leaked, the heating system was broken, and the plumbing constantly dripped. By day, weak sunlight filtered through the cracks in the roof, and by night, icy winds snuck through the walls. Hope Shelter was barely hanging on. Sophie knew that without urgent repair funding, the center would be forced to shut down in a matter of months. The winter was growing harsher, and she couldn't bear to imagine what would happen to the homeless if they lost their only refuge. Sophie's fight began with launching an online fundraising campaign and organizing small charity events at the hospital. But the amount collected was far too little. The community had grown accustomed to the center's presence. But most believed its upkeep was the government's responsibility, not theirs. Jack Cole entered the hospital for his annual health checkup, a routine he maintained every year, despite always being in top condition. After completing the paperwork, Jack sat in the long hallway, quietly observing his surroundings. From a distance, he noticed the nurse he had seen the night before. She stood near the reception desk, speaking with an older colleague. For reasons he couldn't explain, Jack felt curious and silently listened in. Hope Shelter is about to close. They said they'll cut the power next week if we can't pay to fix the heating system. Sophie sighed softly, gripping the pen in her coat pocket. Aren't you fundraising? The colleague asked. Yes, but we've only raised a small portion, Sophie replied with a faint smile, hiding her disappointment. The roof is in terrible shape. Last time it rained, water leaked everywhere. If we don't fix it, the shelter won't survive this winter. Jack furrowed his brows. He had never heard of Hope Shelter, and its existence had never crossed his radar. But there was no mistaking the tone in the girl's voice. Worry, regret, and an undeniable desire to protect something greater than herself. After Sophie left the counter, Jack approached and inquired about Hope Shelter at the reception. In just a few short minutes, he learned that the shelter housed dozens of homeless individuals each night, and Sophie was one of its biggest contributors. Chapter 3. The Turning Point. That evening, Jack didn't head straight home. Instead, he drove to the address of Hope Shelter. The center was housed in an old building, tucked away from the bustling parts of the city. As Jack stepped out of his car, he quietly observed the shelter's deteriorating condition. A faded sign hung loosely over the rusted iron gate. A dim yellow light flickered from a small window, signaling someone was still inside. Jack walked closer and peered through the glass. Inside, the nurse from the hospital sat with a group of homeless people. She handed out steaming bowls of soup and laughed with them as if they were her family. The sight left Jack standing still for a long moment. Hope Shelter wasn't a beautiful building, but it radiated a warmth Jack had never felt in the luxurious hotels he owned. Snowflakes gently fell as Jack Cole pushed open the old iron gate of Hope Shelter. The piercing creak shattered the silence of the winter morning. The shelter stood before him, a two-story building with cracked plaster, uneven roof tiles, and a sign faded by time. Jack wasn't sure why he was there. Since overhearing that conversation at the hospital, thoughts of the shelter had haunted him. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe it was the image of that petite girl helping the homeless man that refused to leave his mind. The door to the shelter was unlocked. After a brief hesitation, Jack pushed it open and stepped inside, immediately feeling the chill seeping through the cracked walls. The interior was simple, with a few bunk beds and thin blankets laid out on the floor. A handful of homeless individuals sat quietly by a small table, sipping steaming bowls of soup. In the corner of the room, the girl he had seen, still in her nurse's uniform, knelt down, fixing an old heater. Strands of hair fell over her face, her hands smudged with grease, but her eyes remained focused, patiently adjusting the rusted parts. Jack stood silently for a while, observing her. "Can I help you with something?" The girl looked up, startled to see Jack standing there. Though they hadn't spoken, she recognized him immediately. It was hard to forget the tall man in an expensive suit who had watched her from afar the night before. Jack took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the heater. "It doesn't seem to be working well." She smiled faintly and resumed her work. It's not working at all, actually. And you're fixing it yourself? Jack raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. We don't have much choice. She rolled up her sleeves, continuing to wrestle with a stubborn bolt. Hiring someone costs money, and the shelter can't afford it. I'm just trying to keep it running for a little longer. Jack moved closer, standing across from her at the heater. He watched her for a long moment before gently extending his hand. I'm Jack. Jack Cole. She looked at him briefly, the wrench still in her grip. His name might have been familiar from business pages, but she didn't seem to care. Sophie Lane. She shook his hand, a quick, firm grip that told Jack plenty about her character. So, you work here all day? Jack asked, attempting to break the silence. Sophie shook her head, setting down the wrench and wiping her hands. I'm a nurse at the hospital, but I spend most of my free time here. Hope Shelter is an important part of this community. Jack glanced around the room, his eyes lingering on the cracks in the walls. The place looks like it's about to fall apart. It probably will, Sophie sighed, leaning against the table. But we'll keep it going as long as we can. The shelter is in serious disrepair, and we desperately need funds to fix it. Jack slipped his hands into his coat pockets, thinking for a few moments before speaking. I could cover the entire cost. Sophie froze, surprise flickering in her eyes. Are you serious? I don't joke, Jack replied firmly. I can pay to fix this place. The heating, the roof, whatever it needs. She straightened up, gratitude flashing across her face. But after a brief hesitation, she shook her head. Thank you, but I can't accept that. What we need is for the community to come together. Jack frowned. Why? It's a good thing. Sophie stepped closer, her voice soft but resolute. Hope Shelter belongs to the community. If it survives because of one person's money, it will crumble the moment that person walks away. We need everyone to contribute. Jack gazed at her, a mix of surprise and confusion in his eyes. He was used to solving problems with money. This was the first time someone had refused his offer so firmly. What can I do then? He asked, his voice quieter. Sophie thought for a moment, then smiled gently. If you really want to help, just cover the structural repairs, the roof, the heating, the essential things. I'll keep rallying the community for the rest. Jack was silent for a long time before finally nodding. All right, I'll fix the building, but the rest, I'll let you handle it. She extended her hand again, but this time it wasn't a polite handshake. Jack took it, gripping firmly in an unspoken agreement. Welcome to the Hope Shelter project. A connection began to form between them after that agreement. Jack didn't just pour money into the project and disappear as he had with past investments. He showed up almost daily, overseeing the workers, coordinating with Sophie, and sometimes even doing small tasks himself, painting walls or carrying materials. Jack realized that Hope Shelter wasn't just a building he was fixing. It was a place helping him discover something he hadn't known before. Peace, and perhaps a reason to stay. Are you still following the story? Comment Coca-Cola to let us know you're with us. Chapter 4. Blossoming Affection. The winter days passed, but the cold lingered in every corner of the city. Snow covered the entrance to Hope Shelter, but inside life continued at a slow yet warm pace. Jack Cole was no longer an outsider. He appeared regularly at the shelter, sometimes with the repair crew, sometimes simply standing beside Sophie, helping her with small tasks. Whenever Jack walked in, everyone greeted him like a familiar face of the center. At first, Sophie was surprised by Jack's persistence. Businessmen like him rarely spent time in places like Hope Shelter. It made her wonder more than once about Jack's true reasons. But regardless of her curiosity, Sophie couldn't deny that his presence made a significant difference. Jack gradually became familiar with the lives at the shelter. He realized Sophie wasn't just a nurse doing her job. She was deeply connected to everyone there. She remembered all their names, knew the stories of each homeless person. Whenever someone needed help, Sophie was the first to step forward, whether it was day or night. The more Jack spent time with her, the more he realized Sophie possessed something special, a steadfast warmth and sincerity he had never encountered before. In Jack's world, relationships revolved around work, contracts, and lavish parties. But Sophie was different. In her, Jack found simplicity and authenticity, something he always felt was missing from his life. Yet Sophie maintained a certain distance. She never acted too familiar, and there was always an invisible wall between them. Jack understood. Their worlds were too different. He was a real estate tycoon, and she was a volunteer nurse. He could buy almost anything with money, while Sophie built her life through compassion and sharing. That night, the snow fell heavier than usual. Hope's shelter lay quiet, with only the dim light in the common room and the crackling fire in the stove. But just before midnight, the heating system suddenly stopped working. Sophie and Jack were the only ones still awake. As the warmth in the room faded, Sophie hurried to find a way to fix it. Jack followed close behind, and together they entered the cold utility room at the back of the shelter. Jack crouched down to inspect the pipes while Sophie searched for the necessary tools. The small room, lacking proper light, was filled with the chilling draft that made them both shiver. Jack frowned at the sight of the worn-out heater. "Can we fix it?" Sophie asked, her voice tinged with concern. Jack smiled, trying to lighten the mood. "I'm not great at this kind of thing, but I think we can give it a shot." In the silence, with only the sound of wind howling outside, Jack and Sophie worked together. Their hands occasionally brushed as they tightened bolts or moved metal parts. Though few words were exchanged, the atmosphere gradually became more comfortable. As the heater began working again, Sophie sat down on the floor, exhaling in relief. Jack sat beside her, leaning against the wall, both watching the flames flicker to life. "I didn't expect you to spend so much time here," Sophie suddenly said, breaking the silence. Jack stared ahead, his voice softening. "I guess I'm searching for something I've never had." Sophie tilted her head slightly, waiting for him to continue. "My childhood was pretty empty," Jack continued, his eyes distant. "My parents passed away early, and I grew up in the coldness of large buildings. I always thought that if I could succeed, everything would be fine. But standing at the top, I realized I had no one beside me." Sophie listened quietly, her eyes reflecting empathy. "My mother was a nurse," she said softly. "She always taught me to help others, no matter who they were or what situation they were in. She used to say that kindness is the only thing we can give without ever running out." Jack turned to her, his gaze softening. "She must have been an incredible person." Sophie smiled gently and nodded. "She was the best person I've ever known." The cold still lingered in the room, and Sophie shivered slightly as the fire hadn't yet fully warmed the space. Jack slipped off his coat and gently draped it over her shoulders. "Thank you," Sophie whispered, bowing her head slightly. The moment stretched on in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. They sat side by side, letting the warmth gradually spread through the thick fabric. For the first time, Jack felt something quietly stir in his heart, a sense of peace, subtle yet profound. And he knew, perhaps he had found what he had been missing all along. Chapter 5. The Event and Ignited Emotions. The snow continued to fall outside, but inside Hope's shelter, the atmosphere was livelier than ever. The fundraising gala that had been in the works for weeks was finally coming to fruition, and the center buzzed like a beehive. Jack and Sophie stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by volunteers hustling to prepare everything. Jack double-checked the guest list and businesses he had contacted, while Sophie distributed the last few invitations. "Are we ready?" Sophie asked, her eyes filled with excitement, but tinged with a hint of worry. Jack looked at her and offered a reassuring smile. "Everything will be fine. I've invited a few friends who can make significant contributions. All you need to do is what you do best. Keep the atmosphere warm and let people see the importance of Hope's shelter." Sophie nodded gently, her soft smile lighting up her face. That evening, the shelter was transformed. The grand ballroom of a luxurious hotel, which Jack had fully sponsored, became the venue for the gala. The crystal chandeliers sparkled, reflecting off the meticulously set tables. Guests began to arrive, from successful entrepreneurs to local residents eager to support the shelter. Jack, dressed in a sleek black suit, stepped onto the stage alongside Sophie, who wore an elegant yet modest dress. "Welcome, everyone, to this special evening," Jack began, his deep voice echoing across the quiet room. "Tonight's goal is not only to raise funds for Hope Shelter, but to spread the message of compassion and humanity throughout this community. Sophie took over, her gaze sweeping across the attentive faces. Hope Shelter is more than just a refuge for the homeless. It is hope, a chance for them to start again. And to sustain that, we need everyone's help. As Sophie spoke, Jack took a step back, his eyes fixed on her. The way she inspired people with her words, the light in her eyes as she spoke of the individuals she cared for. He found it impossible to look away. As applause erupted from the audience, their eyes met across the stage. Sophie smiled and Jack returned it with a soft gaze. As if for a brief moment, the crowded room faded, leaving just the two of them. When the gala concluded, the guests began to depart, leaving behind an atmosphere filled with hope, yet tinged with a trace of doubt. Sophie and Jack reviewed the donation list, and as the final tally appeared, they saw the number had exceeded their goal. Sophie beamed at Jack. "Thank you for saving this shelter." Jack stepped closer, his eyes gentle yet resolute. "I don't just want to save the shelter, Sophie. I want to stay by your side." His words left Sophie speechless. In that moment, the room seemed to fall silent. The warmth in Jack's eyes enveloped her, and Sophie felt as if the invisible wall between them slowly dissolved. Later that night, they stood outside Hope Shelter, gazing at the lights shining through the snowy veil. Sophie leaned quietly against the railing, with Jack standing by her side. "Thank you, Jack. Not just for the shelter, but for everything," Sophie whispered. Jack looked at her, a faint smile on his lips. "I should be the one thanking you. You've shown me something I never thought I could find." Under the soft glow of the streetlights, both Sophie and Jack realized that not only had Hope Shelter been saved, but they had also found a renewed sense of hope in life and in each other. We'd love to hear your feedback. Leave a comment and let us know how you felt after watching the video. Your feedback is the motivation for us to continue bringing more meaningful stories. Chapter 6. A New Beginning Together. Winter slowly gave way to the gentle sunlight of early spring. Hope Shelter donned a completely new look. The walls were freshly painted, the roof solid, and the heating system working smoothly. Every corner of the center breathed with renewal, the result of months of effort that Jack and Sophie had built together. Jack stood in front of the shelter's gate, his eyes following the children playing in the yard. Sophie stepped out, radiating the same simplicity, but with an undeniable energy. She looked at him, a soft smile gracing her lips. "It looks good," Jack said, admiring the building with pride. "It's more than good," Sophie replied, standing beside him. "Without you, this place wouldn't still be here." Jack turned to her, his gaze softer than ever. "Without you, I wouldn't have found a reason to start this in the first place." Hope Shelter was no longer just a refuge for the homeless. The center had expanded to offer mental health support, job training, and became a beacon for those seeking a second chance in life. Jack continued to fund community programs, but this time, he wasn't doing it alone. Sophie stood by his side in every project. Day by day, they met with volunteers, discussed plans to expand the center, and worked on developing similar projects in other cities. Gradually, Jack realized he wasn't just investing in real estate, he was investing in a more meaningful life, with Sophie at the center of everything he pursued. The following winter, as snowflakes drifted outside, Jack and Sophie stood on the second-floor balcony of Hope Shelter, watching the snow fall softly. Below, children played in the yard, their laughter echoing in the peaceful air. Jack gently adjusted Sophie's scarf, worried she might get cold. She smiled, leaning against the railing, her eyes reflecting quiet satisfaction. "You've shown me," Jack suddenly said, his voice low but full of emotion, "that sometimes a home isn't made of walls, but of someone willing to open their heart." Sophie turned, surprised by the sincerity in Jack's eyes. She didn't say anything. She simply held his gaze. "I stayed because of you, Sophie," Jack whispered, his eyes never leaving hers. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. "Jack." He smiled softly and stepped closer, gently taking her hand. "I want to make this place a home for everyone, and for you and me." Sophie looked into his eyes, happiness quietly blooming within her. Slowly, Jack knelt down and pulled out a small velvet box from his coat pocket. Opening the box, a delicate silver ring shimmered softly under the fading light of sunset. Sophie, you taught me that love isn't something you can buy. It's something you build, day by day. Let me build that with you. Will you marry me? Sophie froze for a moment, then a joyful smile spread across her face. Yes, Jack, I will. Jack rose, gently slipping the ring onto her finger, and wrapped her in his arms. Under the snowy sky, they stood together, as if time had paused to witness the union of two souls who had found each other in the cold of winter. Their wedding took place on a warm spring day in the small courtyard of Hope Shelter. They decided on a simple ceremony, attended by those they had helped and the volunteers who had become like family. Sophie wore a simple but elegant dress, while Jack stood beside her, his eyes never leaving the woman he loved. They exchanged vows in front of everyone, under the gentle morning sunlight. As their lips met for the first time as husband and wife, the children cheered, and the once homeless guests clapped with joy. Hope Shelter was no longer just a reintegration center. It had become a symbol of companionship, love, and new hope. After the wedding, Jack and Sophie continued to expand their outreach projects to other cities. They traveled far and wide, building new centers and offering help to those searching for second chances. Despite their busy lives, they always found time for each other, sharing simple yet meaningful moments. Their love wasn't built on grandeur, but on the small, sincere, and humble acts of everyday life. Day by day, Jack came to understand that true happiness wasn't in wealth or status, but in finding someone to walk beside him through every step of the journey. And with Sophie by his side, Jack knew he had finally found his real home. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to hit like and share to spread the story to more people. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to never miss our latest videos. Thank you, and see you next time.